Welcome to a story unlike any other, a chilling tale of a man whose thirst for blood was only matched by his pursuit of criminals. This isn't your typical serial killer case. This is the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, also known as Pedrinho Matador, or Little Peter, the Killer. A man who became infamous for taking the law into his own hands by killing those he deemed deserving. Criminals, gangsters, and even corrupt officials. He was a vigilante, but with a body count that rivals some of the most notorious serial killers in history. But what drives a man to hunt down and execute his fellow criminals? Was he seeking justice, or was he simply another violent predator? Today, we dive deep into the shocking crimes of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a man who blurred the lines between hero and monster. Join me as we unravel the twisted tale of one of Brazil's most notorious killers. From his brutal beginnings to his relentless spree of violence, we will explore the darkness that shaped him and left a country in fear. Buckle up, because this is a journey into the mind of a killer who saw himself as the ultimate executioner of justice. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life of crime began much earlier than most. At just 14 years old, he committed his first murder, and it wasn't a random act of violence. Fueled by revenge, Pedro's target was a local politician. This man had fired Pedro's father from his job as a school guard after accusing him of stealing food. To young Pedro, this was an injustice that demanded blood, and so, without hesitation, he tracked down the politician and executed him in cold blood. This was no ordinary start to a life of crime. It was the beginning of a personal war, where Pedro would take the law into his own hands. But this first kill was only the beginning. Soon after, Pedro's taste for vengeance grew, and his targets became more dangerous. People, he believed, deserved to die. Was it the loss of his father's livelihood that ignited this deadly fire? Or had something darker been festering inside Pedro all along? His violent path was now set, and nothing would stop him from becoming one of Brazil's most feared vigilante killers. Pedro Rodrigues Filho didn't just stop at one murder. After taking his first life at 14, he unleashed a brutal and relentless killing spree that would earn him the infamous title, the Killer of Killers. But unlike most serial murderers, Pedro had a clear focus. His victims were almost always other criminals. From drug dealers and gang leaders to murderers themselves, Pedro saw these men as the scum of society, people who, in his mind, deserved to die. In one shocking episode, Pedro tracked down a local drug dealer who was responsible for his pregnant girlfriend's death. He not only killed the dealer, but went on to slaughter several members of his gang. For Pedro, this was personal justice. His spree of vigilantism escalated quickly. Wherever Pedro went, bodies were left behind. People he believed were corrupt, evil, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But was Pedro really cleaning up the streets? Or was he just another psychopath hiding behind the mask of justice? At one point, Pedro even killed his own father, after learning his father had murdered his mother. In a chilling twist, Pedro confronted his father in prison, stabbing him to death. And in one final act of horror, he cut out his father's heart, chewed a piece of it, and discarded the rest. To Pedro, this was more than revenge. It was retribution. But with every life he took, the lines blurred further between justice and madness. Was Pedro a vigilante hero? Or was he simply a monster driven by bloodlust? As the bodies piled up, the answer became harder to define. By the time Pedro Rodrigues Filho was finally captured and sent to prison, his reign of terror should have ended, but it didn't. In fact, Pedro's time behind bars became just another chapter in his violent story, as he continued his deadly spree within the walls of the prison system. While most inmates might focus on surviving prison life, Pedro saw it as a new hunting ground. He wasted no time seeking out and killing fellow inmates whom he deemed unworthy of life. His targets were often those convicted of violent crimes like rape or murder, aligning with his twisted sense of vigilante justice. One infamous incident saw Pedro kill his cellmate just hours after being placed in a new prison cell. The man had been convicted of raping a woman, and to Pedro, this was an unforgivable sin. The prison system, meant to contain him, became another arena for him to deliver his brutal version of justice. In total, Pedro claimed at least 47 lives while incarcerated, proving that not even the confines of prison could stop him. His actions left authorities and fellow inmates alike in fear, knowing that Pedro was just as dangerous inside the prison walls as he had been on the streets. What drives a man to continue killing even when he has nothing left to gain? Was Pedro simply fulfilling a personal vendetta, or was the desire to kill too deeply rooted in his psyche to be stopped? His time in prison revealed a man who was as relentless as he was deadly. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story forces us to ask difficult questions about justice and morality. On the surface, Pedro was a serial killer, responsible for more than 70 deaths. But unlike most killers, his victims were often criminals themselves, people he believed deserved to die. This raises a fundamental question. Was Pedro a twisted kind of hero, or simply a monster in disguise? To some, Pedro was a vigilante, someone willing to do what the justice system couldn't, eliminate the worst of society. His killings of drug dealers, rapists, and murderers earned him a strange kind of admiration from certain groups in Brazil, who saw him as a man who was cleaning up the streets. But can murder ever truly be justified, even when the victims are criminals? For others, Pedro was no hero, but a cold-blooded killer who used his warped sense of justice to justify his insatiable need for violence. His murders were brutal and often carried out with chilling precision. His crimes against criminals didn't make him any less of a murderer in the eyes of the law. After all, who gets to decide who deserves to live or die? Pedro believed he had the right, but does anyone? The morality of vigilantism is never black and white. It challenges the lines between justice and vengeance, hero and villain. In Pedro's case, these lines blur even further. Was he a man who believed he was doing what was right? Or was he simply using the idea of justice as an excuse for murder? And what about the people who admire him? Does their support suggest a deeper flaw in the justice system itself? These questions continue to haunt Pedro's legacy. Whether you see him as a hero or a monster, one thing is clear. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was a man who lived and died by his own code, a code written in blood. After decades of terrorizing both the streets and prison cells, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was released from prison in 2007. Despite his staggering body count, Brazil's laws at the time prevented him from serving more than 30 years, regardless of how many lives he took. The man known as Pedrinho Matador, the killer of killers, was now a free man. But his time outside wouldn't last long. Upon his release, Pedro became somewhat of a celebrity in Brazil. Many were shocked that someone with such a violent past could be walking free. Some saw him as a reformed man, while others feared that he would return to his murderous ways. Pedro himself claimed that he had left his life of crime behind and that he was ready to live as a free man. He even began speaking publicly about his past, and in interviews, he described his killings with chilling calmness, as if discussing the weather. However, peace was short-lived. In 2011, Pedro was arrested again on charges of inciting riots and making death threats. Despite his claim of turning over a new leaf, Pedro couldn't escape the violent life that had shaped him for so long. Once again, he found himself behind bars, proving that his story was far from over. Pedro's release and rearrest only added to his growing legend. Some viewed him as a man who couldn't be tamed, while others saw him as a tragic figure trapped in a cycle of violence. The media fueled the myth of Pedrinho Matador, turning him into a symbol of both fear and fascination. But what truly lies behind the legend? Was Pedro a reformed man struggling to live in a world that once feared him, or was he always destined to return to the darkness? His brief time of freedom only deepened the mystery of a man whose life was defined by violence. What drives a man like Pedro Rodrigues Filho to kill with such brutal conviction? Was it his upbringing, the environment he was raised in, or something deeper rooted in his psychology? To truly understand the mind of this killer of killers, we need to examine the factors that shaped him. Pedro was born into a life of violence. His father was abusive, and his mother suffered at his hands. Growing up in such a hostile environment no doubt played a role in the development of Pedro's violent tendencies. Some experts believe that exposure to this level of domestic violence at an early age may have conditioned him to see violence as a solution to problems. But Pedro's crimes go beyond just reacting to a harsh childhood. His murders were not random acts of rage. They were calculated, often with a clear motive in his mind, to rid society of people he believed deserved death. This sense of vigilantism hints at a psychological profile, much more complex than simple criminality. Pedro saw himself as judge, jury, and executioner, which suggests a distorted sense of morality, a need to assert control and authority over life and death. Some psychologists have pointed to the possibility of Pedro suffering from antisocial personality disorder, which could explain his lack of remorse for his crimes and his cold, calculated approach to murder. His interviews, where he speaks about his killings with an eerie calmness, suggest a detachment from empathy and guilt, hallmark traits of a psychopathic personality. Yet, Pedro's choice of victims, mostly criminals, adds another layer to his psyche. It's almost as if he believed he was performing a public service, a dark form of justice that the legal system couldn't provide. This justification for his murders makes his mind even more difficult to decode. Was he simply a product of his environment, or was he always destined to become a killer? Pedro's psychological profile remains a topic of debate. What's clear is that he was driven by a combination of personal trauma, a distorted sense of justice, and a deep-rooted need for control. But how much of his killing spree can be explained by his past, and how much was simply the making of a man born with a mind for murder? Pedro Rodrigues Filho, or Pedrinho Matador, will forever be remembered as one of Brazil's most notorious and controversial figures. His story is one of relentless violence, moral ambiguity, and a lifetime spent in the pursuit of what he believed was justice. But what is his legacy today? How does a man responsible for so many deaths continue to captivate public attention and even gain a twisted sense of admiration from some? For many, Pedro is a symbol of Brazil's failing justice system, a man who took the law into his own hands because he believed the system couldn't do its job. His killings of rapists, murderers, and drug dealers sparked both fear and fascination, turning him into a larger-than-life figure. In some circles, Pedro is seen as a folk hero, a vigilante who delivered justice where it was lacking. But in the eyes of the law, he was a murderer, plain and simple. Pedro's legacy also reflects a broader societal obsession with the idea of the vigilante, someone who operates outside the confines of the legal system to bring what they see as justice. Movies, books, and media often glamorize figures like Pedro, creating a dangerous line between admiration and revulsion. But can someone like Pedro really be a hero? Or was he simply a violent man who found a way to justify his killings? Today, Pedro's tale is remembered as both a cautionary story and a grim reflection on the darker side of justice. His life challenges us to think about the fine line between right and wrong, and whether the ends ever truly justify the means. In the end, Pedro's legacy is one written in blood, a haunting reminder of what happens when violence becomes the answer to violence. His name, Pedrinho Matador, will forever be etched into the history of Brazil, not just as a killer, but as a man whose twisted sense of morality turned him into an enigma that still captivates true crime fans and criminal psychologists alike. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life forces us to confront the darkest parts of human nature. He was a man who believed he was serving justice by killing those he deemed unworthy of life. But in the end, his actions raise more questions than they answer. Was he truly serving a form of justice, or was he trapped in an endless cycle of violence, unable to escape his own demons? Pedro's story is not just about one man's killing spree. It's about the fine line between law and lawlessness, between justice and vengeance. His life paints a grim picture of a world where the boundaries between good and evil blur, leaving us to wonder whether Pedro was simply a product of his environment or if he was destined to become the killer he became. But what do we make of his legacy? Can we ever truly separate the man from the myth, the vigilante from the criminal? As we close the book on Pedro Rodrigues Filho, we are left with a chilling question. Was justice ever truly served? Or was Pedro just another example of a world where violence only begets more violence? One thing is certain: Pedro's story will continue to haunt and fascinate for years to come. His tale is a stark reminder that in the darkest corners of society, justice is not always what it seems. The legacy of Pedrinho Matador may be written in blood, but it is also a reflection of a society struggling with its own sense of right and wrong. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's eventual capture was as intense and dramatic as his life of crime. For years, authorities had been chasing a man who seemed to elude the law at every turn, a vigilante killer who hunted criminals while evading capture himself. But what went on behind the scenes of this manhunt? How did law enforcement finally bring down one of Brazil's most dangerous criminals? Pedro's capture came after years of investigative work. He wasn't just a killer on the loose. He was a man known for targeting the underworld, making him both feared and hard to track. His knowledge of the criminal landscape gave him an edge, allowing him to stay a step ahead of the law. The police knew that capturing Pedro would take more than just brute force. They needed strategy, patience, and luck. The breakthrough came when authorities began to connect a series of violent murders, all pointing back to one man, Pedrinho Matador. His pattern of targeting criminals led investigators to stake out known criminal hotspots, knowing that Pedro often lurked where other criminals thrived. But it wasn't just about tracking his movements. It was also about understanding his mind. Police began to build a psychological profile of Pedro, hoping to predict his next moves. In the end, it was a combination of persistence and precision that led to his downfall. Pedro was finally cornered and arrested in a raid that could have easily turned deadly. Even during his arrest, Pedro was defiant, showing no fear and even boasting about his crimes. It took multiple officers to subdue him, marking the end of his violent reign, at least on the outside. But his capture wasn't the end of Pedro's killings. As we've seen, even within the walls of prison, Pedro continued his lethal ways. His ability to survive, kill, and manipulate the environment around him made him a truly terrifying figure, even after his capture. This bonus chapter gives us a glimpse into the intense manhunt and the tactics that finally put an end to Pedro's spree. But it also shows just how difficult it was to stop a man whose entire life was built around death. Pedro may have been captured, but his legacy as Pedrinho Matador, the killer of killers, lived on. And that's the story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a man whose violent legacy still leaves us with more questions than answers. Was he a hero delivering justice in a broken system, or simply another monster who used his own brand of justice to justify his bloodlust? Pedro's life and crimes force us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and the blurred lines between right and wrong. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most complex and chilling criminal minds in history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the twisted world of Pedrinho Matador, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more true crime stories that will take you to the edge of the unknown. What are your thoughts on Pedro? Was he a vigilante or just another serial killer? I'd love to hear your opinions, so drop them in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next episode as we continue exploring the darkest mysteries and coldest cases from around the world. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep questioning the truth.